Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, today we are talking about virtue ethics. And as I noted Friday, I believe it was, virtue ethics is a theory that actually spans two great civilizations. Uh, it was formulated independently in the West by Aristotle and in the East Asia by Confucius at about roughly the same time. Um, what unites virtue ethics? What's the tie that binds, as it were? For both thinkers, the emphasis is not necessary. It's not on action, although action is important, right? What you do is important, but what's more important, much more important, for a virtue ethicist is what kind of person you are. So the emphasis is on character, developing one's moral character. Well, how do you develop moral character? You study the virtues. What's a virtue? A virtue, as Aristotle defines it, is a quality of excellence manifested in habitual action that is useful for both the bearer and for society. The habitual action part of the equation is extremely important. Moral instruction, and this is true for both Aristotle and Confucius, it must begin in youth, right? If you don't learn what it is to be a moral person, if you don't begin your moral training as a child, right, it doesn't take, right? Um, you think about it, right? The first moral lesson that any of us learn, we learn at a fairly young age, 2, 3, and that's to share, right? It's funny. I joke with the students all the time about this. Face-to-face classes. The first 5 words that any child learns in any language are yes, no, mom, dad, and mine, right? You see little kids all the time clutching things that they have to their chest and saying mine, right? So we have to learn how to share. Well, so it is with all moral instruction. It's got to begin early, and it's got to become something that you don't even necessarily have to give much thought to, right? Then obviously there are going to be moral situations that aren't easily resolved, and you will have to engage in moral deliberation and reasoning. But by and large, the more that you can rely on your uh, habitual moral reflection to take over and guide you in a situation, the better off you'll be, right? But even this isn't necessarily sufficient to make someone moral, right? So, for both thinkers, what you need to do, what's extremely important to do, is to find an exemplar. You need to find someone to emulate morally. So, this could be, an older, it could be your father, it could be your mother, it could be a professor, it could be whomever, right? There's even some hint that it could be someone fictional, right? Like you could choose to emulate Gandalf, right? But regardless, what you do is you adopt their way of behaving, right? And initially, you're just going through the motions because you don't know what it is to be a virtuous person. But the more you practice it, right, the more it becomes your own. It's a lot like an actor playing a role. The more you work at being virtuous, the more virtue actually sinks in and takes, right? So, what virtue really is for Aristotle is it's a way of finding a way. It's a method for finding a way of acting between two extremes, right? So for any given virtue that you consider, there are two ways you can go wrong. You can have the vice of excess, which means you have too much of the virtue, or you can have the vice of deficiency, which means you have too little of the virtue. So let's take courage, for example. If you have too much courage, you are rash or foolhardy. You rush in where angels fear to tread, as the old saying goes. If you have too little courage, then you are, and I love this word, it's a good word for you guys to know, pusillanimous. It's a $10 word for cowardly, right? Let's take another example of this. Patience. If you're too patient, you're a pushover. If you don't have enough patience, then you are hot-headed, or here's a good word for you, irascible, right? So it's a balancing act for for Aristotle. You don't want to have too much of a virtue. You don't want to have too little. You want to have the golden mean, as he puts it, right? Just the right amount, right? For Confucius, this belief is manifested in what's known as observing ritual propriety. Confucius places a big emphasis on ritual as a means of tempering our bad qualities and bringing to the fore our good or more moderate qualities. But for both thinkers, again, it's important to learn the various virtues and to embody them and avoid going to extremes. Now, a criticism of virtue ethics that often makes the rounds is, there are several. We'll talk about the first one because Aristotle anticipates this objection and he has a good response to it. The objection is, well, if we go to China or if we go to Ghana or India, and we find that the virtues that the Chinese, the Ghanaians, the Indians emphasize are not the same as, say, the Greeks, then this has disturbing implications, because this means that virtue ethics is a relativist theory. But Aristotle has a brilliant response. He has a ready response for this, and he notes all human beings, despite our various cultural differences, we share a human condition, meaning we have limited powers and we have limited means to address the situations that come up. So human beings, try as they might, they often find themselves in dangerous situations. If you're in a dangerous situation, you need courage. If you need a change in your life, you need courage to take a change, or to enact a change, right? If you find yourself, you need friends, you're in a strange city, right? You just moved to a strange city, a new city, and you're trying to make friends. In addition to courage, well, you're going to need friendliness, which is a virtue, and you're also going to need loyalty. You can't keep your friends if you're not loyal. So this is a situation, a very familiar situation, regardless of what culture you're born into. And these virtues are going to be universal because, again, human beings find themselves in similar situations, regardless of race, gender, culture, sexuality. Doesn't matter, right? Here's another really good example. Honesty. You cannot have effective communication across in any given human society, let alone across cultures, without honesty. Without honesty, we just don't trust what our interlocutors say, right? So we must assume that they're being honest, that there's veracity and truth in what they say, and trust, should be noted, also winds up becoming a very important virtue. So in short, there's no way that virtue ethics can be a relativistic theory given our shared, again, human condition. It's often, one criticism I often hear of virtue ethics is that virtue ethics doesn't give you any specific advice for being in moral situations. And I think that's intentional on part of Aristotle and Confucius, right? And later, more recent virtue ethicists have tried to address this, but to me, I've always found that criticism to ring hollow, because moral theories are designed to give you broad brush advice, right? No moral theory can give you specific advice about when you're in situation X, perform action Y. That's just far beyond the scope, the purview of moral theory. For that, you have to rely on your empathy, you have to rely on reason, and you have to rely on what's known as moral instincts. And moral instinct, or intuition is another way to put it. Moral intuition is just cultivating all that good moral reasoning that you, again, have worked on and you've worked through your entire life to specific situations that you find yourself in. So tomorrow we will talk about the last of the major ethical theories, and that is Carol Gilligan's feminist care ethics.